Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, and this video is the next reading in part 2 of our book. So it's the 4 fundamental questions. This is the second question, what is real? We went over Nietzsche's The Gay Science in the previous video, and now we have Henri Bergson. So, the reading is entitled An Introduction to Metaphysics. So, metaphysics, he will explain what is metaphysics, and it's the science of what he'll describe as intuition. And this is the crux of the whole reading here. He says, on page 209, there's 2 types of knowing. He says, philosophers throughout the ages have had their differences of opinion, but they all agree that there are 2 ways of knowing things. So on page 209, the second sentence, he says, the first implies that we move round the object, the second that we enter into it. The first depends on the point of view at which we are placed and on the symbols by which we express ourselves. The second neither depends on a point of view nor relies on any symbol. The first kind of knowledge may be said to stop at the relative, the second, in those cases where it is possible, to attain the absolute. So he's a pretty good writer. He sums up his ideas neatly in one paragraph. So analysis is what he'll call that relative knowledge, that you learn something by looking at it from outside, from different points of views, and then you express your knowledge through symbols. That's analysis. And he'll call the knowledge gained by becoming one with a thing and knowing it from the inside, he'll call that intuition. So analysis would be what most people would call science, empirical science. We've been going over rationalism and empiricism. Empiricism says the source of knowledge is your sense perceptions, your empirical observations. If you can see it or smell it, taste it, hear it, or touch it, then that's real knowledge because it's rooted to some sense impression. And that kind of knowledge Bergson would call analysis. You analyze something from outside, looking at it from different points of view, from in front of it, behind it, underneath of it. And then you describe that knowledge with symbols. So, I've used this metaphor before. Here is the mouse for this computer. It's black. So the word black is a symbol for this color. But that word applies to all kinds of different things. This pen is black. So you're describing one thing by comparing it to something that it isn't. It's not uniquely, this isn't the only thing that's black. What's unique about this mouse in itself? Well, Bergson will say you wouldn't be able to express it with words because words inherently compare things, relate them to other things. It's relative. You have to, when you're describing this, you have to describe it from which perspective are you looking at it. And for example, Einstein talked about relativity theory, but one common experience most of us have had of how analysis are looking at things from the outside, how your knowledge of it is relative to your point of view, is if you're in a on a train and all of a sudden the train starts to slowly move, it looks for a moment like the train platform is moving and you're standing still. Or if you're in a car and then you see the car next to you start to pull forward, you might think you're going backwards. Einstein would say, your motion through space, you can just as well say, if you're on the train and you start to pull forward, it's just as good to say the train is standing still and the whole earth is moving and the train is just rolling on the tracks because the earth is moving. Both descriptions are equivalent, just which one's easier for your for your situation and what you're trying to describe. But the point of it all is analysis describes things from the outside. So how do you have an intuition? Well, he'd say you have to have some kind of a sympathy, a sympathetic imagination, an intellectual sympathy. On page 211, the second paragraph. He says, "It follows from this that an absolute can only be given in an intuition, whilst everything else falls within the province of analysis. By intuition is meant the kind of intellectual sympathy by which one places oneself within an object in order to coincide with what is unique in it and consequently inexpressible. Analysis, on the contrary, is the operation which reduces the object to elements already known, that is, to elements common both to it and other objects. To analyze, therefore, is to express a thing as a function of something other than itself. All analysis is thus a translation, a development into symbols, a representation taken from successive points of view from which we note as many resemblances as possible between the new object which we are studying and others which we believe we know already. In its eternally unsatisfied desire to embrace the object around which it is compelled to turn, analysis multiplies without end the number of its points of view in order to complete its always incomplete representation, and ceaselessly varies its symbols that it may perfect the always imperfect translation. It goes on, therefore, to infinity, but intuition, if intuition is possible, is a simple act." So an intuition, a kind of intellectual sympathy. I can describe this mouse from an infinite number of points of view. From here, from here, from here, from here. I can describe it using mathematics, weighing it, what is it, what are its colors. There's an infinite number of ways I could translate this thing and describe it with symbols. And it would never completely describe what this is unique about this thing itself. However, through an act of intellectual sympathy, if that's possible, for me to imagine what it is, to be this piece of plastic, this mouse, then I would know what it is all at once. I wouldn't have to add up all of these analytical facts. I would simply know what it is. Is it possible to become something outside of your own physical body? When I teach this class and I come to this part, I usually think of one of the sequels to the original Matrix movie. I forget which one it is, but Neo, if you've seen this movie, they live in a computer hologram, or a computer-generated reality, which most people take to be reality. We're going to deal with this directly in the next reading, Nick Bostrom, where he talks about this, so it's not entirely out of line here. But so people get out of the matrix, they realize what's going on, then they go back into the matrix to help others escape, just like in Plato's cave allegory. So in one of these movies where Neo, the hero, is back inside the computer program, there's a waiting room for all these runner-ups for who's going to be the one who saves everybody from the matrix. And there's this little boy, looks like a little Buddhist monk, and he's holding a spoon and he's bending the spoon, you know, with his mind. And then Neo looks at it, and then the little boy says, "It's not that you are bending the spoon, but you realize that you are the spoon, and then you bend yourself." So then Neo looks at the spoon, and then the spoon bends over. So through some kind of an act of intellectual sympathy, he became one with the spoon, and then he bent himself. So that is what Bergson is talking about. But then he says, you know, maybe it's not possible to become one with something outside yourself, but at least it should be possible to know yourself through an act of intuition, through some act of self-realization. And what would that experience be like? You wouldn't be able to translate it perfectly into symbols. You would know what you are all at once. It would be a simple act of realization as opposed to adding one point of view to another symbolic representation to another. You'd know it all at once, which is similar to Plato's ideas of the ideas, the absolute ideas. They are simple things. They're not compounded of other things. But we'll get to that in these discussion questions. So continuing on page 211, if you look at that bottom, the last full paragraph, the very last sentence, he says, "Metaphysics, then, is the science which claims to dispense with symbols. There is one reality, at least, which we all seize from within by intuition and not by simple analysis. It is our own personality and its flowing through time, our self which endures. So, what are you? Who or what am I? That was the first fundamental question. And Bergson is saying that's the only thing you can know directly without comparing it to other things, is your own self, your inner awareness. And on page 212, he goes through a process to help him explain what he feels as his own self enduring through time. And it's important to note that he says, there's two types of knowing, analysis and intuition, but analysis can help you prepare to have an intuition. I went over that when we went over the Tao Te Ching. Why, if you can't express the Tao in words, why did you write 81 chapters of the Tao Te Ching? That was one of the discussion questions. Why did Lao Tzu write it if you can't express it in words? So then I read on page 213, the bottom paragraph where Bergson describes, what's the use of analysis for the process of intuition? How can it help? How can it help at least to know what the self is? So I'll read that again here, and then I'll go back to page 212 where he describes, using symbols, what it's like to ultimately end up with an intuition of the self. But the bottom paragraph on page 213, he says, this is speaking about his own inner life that can't be described with images. He says, but it is even less possible to represent it by concepts. So analysis uses not only symbols, which are things like words, but it also uses concepts, stringing words together to create some kind of a theory about what the self is. So, the materialist theory, the concept of the self is a conjunction of different chemical atoms to create DNA. That's life. That's a concept. It's using words that symbolize things to create this abstract concept, which Bergson is saying that will never give you knowledge of what it is to be a self. So, but it is even less possible to represent it by concepts, that is, by abstract, general, or simple ideas. It is true that no image can reproduce exactly the original feeling I have of the flow of my own conscious life, but it is not even necessary that I should attempt to render it. If a man is incapable of getting for himself the intuition of the constitutive duration of his own being, nothing will ever give it to him, concepts no more than images. Here, the single aim of the philosopher, so there's a bold statement, the single aim of the philosopher should be to promote a certain effort, which in most men is usually fettered by habits of mind more useful to life. So what effort is it that philosophers' single aim should be to promote to people who are usually consumed with practical daily affairs? What kind of an effort are you talking about? He says, now the image has at least this advantage, that it keeps us in the concrete. No image can replace the intuition of duration, but many diverse images borrowed from very different orders of things made by the convergence of their action direct consciousness to the precise point where there is a certain intuition to be seized. So that's what philosophers should do. Use images and concepts and all of these tools of analysis, not in the hopes of ever directly describing what the self is, but rather to zero in on this point of analytical knowledge that is ripe for an intuition to occur. To prepare people to have this sudden intuition, the spark of cognition, of intuition, inner knowledge of yourself from the inside. That is what he's saying the single aim of a philosopher should be. All right, so let's see how Bergson does. When he's trying to help us have an intuition of the self, he describes what it was like for him to start to meditate on the self. So the first full paragraph on page 212, he says, when I direct my attention inward to contemplate my own self, supposed for the moment to be inactive, I perceive at first, as a crust solidified on the surface, all the perceptions which come to it from the material world. I'm going to skip around a little bit. Next, I notice the memories which more or less adhere to these perceptions and which serve to interpret them. Skipping down a little more, he says, lastly, I feel the stir of tendencies and motor habits, a crowd of virtual actions more or less firmly bound to these perceptions and memories. So he's starting from the outside and working his way in. So all the sense perceptions, that's the outermost part. Then they trigger certain memories. You know, you might smell something that makes you remember something from your childhood. Then below that, he feels these, what he calls these motor habits, so reflexes, instinctive reactions. You start to feel that. That's getting a little closer to the self. Continuing here on this top paragraph on page 212, he says, all these clearly defined elements appear more distinct from me the more distinct they are from each other. Radiating as they do from within outwards, they form collectively the surface of a sphere which tends to grow larger and lose itself in the exterior world. But if I draw myself in from the periphery towards the center, if I search in the depth of my being, that which is most uniformly, most constantly, and most enduringly myself, I find an altogether different thing. So then he goes on to describe what it's like to experience the self using symbols, which he already admits will never describe what is unique about a thing, because it's always comparing it to something that it isn't. But you should, the philosopher, he's saying, should use these symbols to help prepare us for an intuition. And he goes up for the next page describing what it's like to experience the duration of yourself. And the conclusion he basically comes to is you can describe it in two polar opposite kinds of ways. In one way, it's like the unrolling of a coil. In another way, it's like rolling things up. So here's yourself. Yourself is expanding itself into the world. So it's like you're flowing out of yourself. On the other hand, you're having experiences and you're gobbling them up. So it's like rolling things up. So then on what was interesting, especially to me, I've been comparing the self or the soul to the gravitational singularity. On page 213, the first full paragraph, he says, let us then rather imagine an infinitely small elastic body contracted, if it were possible, to a mathematical point. Let this be drawn out gradually in such a manner that from the point comes a constantly lengthening line. Let us fix our attention not on the line as a line, but on the action by which it is traced. Let us bear in mind that this action, in spite of its duration, is indivisible. Then he's saying, let us free ourselves from the concept of space, and so that movement of the single point, infinitely elastic point, enduring through time and space. Now, get rid of space, and you just have pure mobility. So he's using these concepts and images to try to help us experience for ourselves, have an intuition of the self. And he says it simultaneously seems like a unity and a multiplicity, but that whole idea of an infinitely elastic mathematical point being his symbol for the self, that fits well with the idea of conceiving of the self as a singularity. It too, it's infinitely dense with all space and time. It seems to be an unrolling coil, but at the same time, it's rolling everything up because it exists simultaneously out at the periphery of space, where space is expanding at the speed of light from our perspective on Earth. So I just, if the aim of a philosopher is to help people have an intuition by providing the proper symbols and concepts, I think today, in 2018, one of the most powerful symbols that comes from analytical science to help you have an intuition of the self is this idea of a gravitational singularity, especially as it's described by holographic string theory, as I've explained before, which says that all of the past, present, and future is contained at every point of the encompassing sphere of the horizon of the cosmos. It radiates in as this shadow world, this holographic illusion. And that holographic film at the outermost sphere of space is radiating from a centralmost point, the gravitational singularity, which is located at each point of its encompassing sphere. So that, the way Henri Bergson describes his idea of what a self is, I think it can be even more precisely, you can be even more precisely prepared for an intuition of the self by studying 21st century cosmology, specifically the newest branch stemming from relativity theory and quantum mechanics. Uniting those two is this string theory. Okay, so I see here I'll be commenting on pages 214 and 215 in response to discussion question 4 about Plato. So I'll leave that alone for now and just turning to page 217. So here's the discussion questions. Discussion question 1. Does the distinction between analysis and intuition make sense to you? Why or why not? So there's no right or wrong answer for does it make sense to you, so long as you understand what Bergson says analysis and intuition are. And that's pretty straightforward. So to go over it again, and I'll have to go over it pretty much for each of these discussion questions since that's the whole point of this reading. Analysis is knowing something from the outside, taking different points of view. You can circumambulate something and know it from every perspective, and then describing those relative points of view with symbols, words, numbers, basic theoretical concepts. That's analysis. Intuition is knowing something from within it. Through some intellectual sympathy, you can become a baseball and know what it's like to get hit out of the park. But even if that's not possible, you should at least be able to have an inner knowledge of your very self. And that science of intuition he calls metaphysics. Okay, discussion question 2. What is the example of walking the streets of the city as opposed to looking at photographs of the city supposed to show? Explain. So if you look on page 210, the bottom paragraph, he says, it is in this sense and in this sense only that absolute is synonymous with perfection. Were all the photographs of a town taken from all possible points of view to go on indefinitely completing one another, they would never be equivalent to the solid town in which we walk about. So walking in the town is like intuition, and looking at the town from all these different photographs, photographic perspectives, would be like analysis. That's what that example is supposed to show. And even though you might have a better understanding of the layout of the city through looking at every photograph taken from every conceivable angle, that will never be the same as being in the city and walking the streets and getting a feel for what the city's actually like. Although it's just a metaphor, because both of those are analysis. Even walking around inside a city, you're just looking at things outside yourself. Unless you could somehow have this intellectual sympathy and become one with the collective consciousness of a city, if such a thing could exist, then, that would be intuition. But at the very least, he says you should be able to know your own self. But that knowledge will never is never capable of being expressed with symbols. Okay, discussion question 3. Do you think there's a big difference between clock time and lived time? Why or why not? All right, so that's just asking you, clock time measures time in a consistent way, ticks off the seconds. It stays the same. Well, when you bring relativity theory into it, if you move a clock, it will measure time more slowly. A clock that is hurtling through space, the seconds will tick off slower than a clock that is stationary. But let's just put relativity theory aside for the moment. What I think of, the movie I think of when I go over this discussion question is Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Ferris Bueller took the day off, but his classmates back in school had to suffer through a boring school day, and one of the scenes is, I forget the guy's name, Ben something, Ben Stein, I think. He had, his famous line was Bueller. Bueller, he was calling off the, taking attendance. And so the whole point of it was he was the most boring professor or teacher that you could imagine. And his voice, I know mine can get the same way sometimes when you're going over these complicated thoughts, but it would be a constant stream of boring monotone. And the students were sitting in their desks and they're looking up at a clock. And the clock is ticking the second hand. And the more the guy speaks, the slower each second seems to tick. And then at a certain point, the guy gets so boring that the seconds stop ticking and then it goes backwards. And time starts to go in reverse. So that was a nice way of showing what lived time is like if you could translate it into clock time. So I think we've all experienced it. There's some times in your life when things are going by so slow because they're so boring. Other times you're having a great time and time flies. Time flies when you're having fun. But a clock just ticks off the time in a consistent mechanical way. So the whole point is clock time would be analysis, looking at something from without and measuring it. And live time would be feeling an inner experience of what time is like. And they seem to be different. Okay, so the fourth discussion question, the most challenging one, this is the last one for Bergson on page 217. Compare Bergson to Plato. What are the main differences in their approaches? Explain. Okay, so Bergson is fairly similar to Plato. The main difference, so there's differences, but the main difference in their approaches is Plato writes in a dialogue form featuring his martyred teacher Socrates, whereas Bergson is just writing in a straightforward essay. It's him as a writer writing to whoever wants to read. Plato removes himself from the writing in a sense and says, Plato, I'm not writing anything. I'm not saying anything. I'm just relating a story of what other people are saying. So there's one different approach. That's just a stylistic difference. But if you then look at how Plato, through the mouthpiece of Socrates, teaches, another main difference in their approach is Socrates is trying to teach people not to be afraid of death, and furthermore to live a life in view of the need to prepare for the afterlife. So he says you must control your bodily appetites in order to prepare for the best possible afterlife, so that your soul, when it reincarnates, can come back in a better body and can furthermore see the absolute truth, culminating with the idea of the good after death. So Bergson doesn't talk about reincarnation. He doesn't talk about life after death. He just talks about realizing what the self is. How can we have knowledge of the inner self? He just describes what that would be. He calls it metaphysics. And it dispenses, that science of the self dispenses with symbols. It does use symbols like every other science, but it uses symbols to prepare people to have an intuition where symbols are no longer useful. Okay, but that was the second part of the question. What are the main differences in their approaches? But the first part is compare Bergson to Plato. So this is their similarities, really. And Plato also, Bergson on page 213 said the single aim of the philosopher should be to promote a certain effort, which in most men is usually fettered by habits of mind more useful to life. So the effort is one that leads to an intuition. That is what Socrates was trying to do. His whole life he had spent trying to help people think about what is the self and not to be overly preoccupied with their temporary material bodies and its appetites. And he would ask people questions, what is the soul? Is there life after death? He was trying to prepare people to have this intuition. And the symbols that he used for the ultimate intuition was, for example, the cave allegory. Coming out of the cave and seeing the sun which is similar to coming out of the illusion of this three-dimensional space and this forward-flowing time to have an insight, to turn the eye of the soul inward and see the source of yourself and everything else, which he calls the idea of the good. That's the goal of philosophy. But just, understanding that concept through these abstract theories, that's not having the actual intuition. The point of describing it using these analytical terms is to help us have this ineffable beatific vision of the idea of the good. Once you've had it, you wouldn't be able to describe it perfectly, but it's still your duty as a philosopher, says Bergson and Socrates, to go back into the cave and try to help other people have this same intuition of the self. So I'm flipping through pages here while I'm talking, and a big similarity between Bergson and Plato is Bergson describes analysis as just giving us knowledge of the shadow of things. On page 214 and 215, about halfway down the page on 214, he says, for on the one hand, all right, so the illusion of thinking you can gain true knowledge through analysis, he says. Analysis is great. You can, analyze an object from every single conceivable point of view, and you can take pictures of it down to the atomic structure. But that's the illusion, he says. If you think you can complete an intellectual model of the thing and then understand it and translate it perfectly into symbols, there precisely is the illusion, he says. There also is the danger. Just insofar as abstract ideas can render service to analysis, that is, to the scientific study of the object in its relations to other objects, so far are they incapable of replacing intuition, that is, the metaphysical investigation of what is essential and unique in the object. For, on the one hand, these concepts, laid side by side, never actually give us more than an artificial reconstruction of the object, of which they can only symbolize certain general and, in a way, impersonal aspects. It is therefore useless to believe that with them we can seize a reality of which they present to us the shadow alone. Over on the top of page 215, he says, everything will depend on the weight we attribute to this or that concept, and this weight will always be arbitrary, since the concept extracted from the object has no weight, being only the shadow of a body. So, the idea of a shadow of a body, that's the fundamental symbol of the cave allegory. The prisoners are shackled from childhood in a cave, in a subterranean cave. Their heads are chained, their legs are chained, they're forced to look forward. Behind them, guards walk back and forth in front of a divider wall that hides their shadows, but they hold above that wall on sticks puppets of objects from the outer world. A blazing fire at the entrance to the cave casts the shadows of those puppets and the prisoners onto the back wall, so that the prisoners take the shadows for reality. That is what Bergson is saying, analysis. Knowledge through analysis is just shadows of reality. To have a knowledge of the actual thing, you'd have to become one with the thing. Now, how does that translate to Plato's cave allegory? Well, somebody from the outer world comes down to the cave, cuts the chains, releases a prisoner, turns the prisoner around. At first, they're blinded by the firelight. They still think the shadows are real, and this is all madness, but they're dragged out of the cave, gradually accustoming themselves to the light by looking at shadows of things, and then reflections in water, and then finally they can see the sun itself. And so that's equivalent to seeing the idea of the good. How's that and in giving you an intuition of other things? Well, if visible light and intellectual light, if everything radiates from the idea of the good, if all of the other absolute ideas are contained within the idea of the good, if the idea of a tree is contained within the idea of the good, and you realize your unity with this fundamental source of being, then you would be able to have an intuition of every single thing that radiates from all of the absolute ideas. You would know a tree from within, because you realize your unity with the idea of the good that contains the idea of the tree from which all the visible trees manifest. So it's very similar to Hinduism. If you become one with Atman, or the supreme Atman, that would give you knowledge of past, present, and future of space. You could have an intuition of every single exterior object if you became one with the source of everything. That is what Socrates describes in the Republic. Bergson doesn't get that metaphysical about it, even though he's describing metaphysics. All right, so I think I will leave, I'll leave off on one other comparison, and that's the idea of an effort, making this effort, the effort of intuition, which is on the bottom paragraph of page 213 for Bergson. Also, the last paragraph of the whole reading on page 216, he says, we do penetrate into it, however, and that can only be by an effort of intuition. In this sense, an inner absolute knowledge of the duration of the self by the self is possible. So you have to make this effort of intuition. And Plato talks about making this ultimate effort in the cave allegory on page 154. He says, all right, so, but whether true or false, this is the top of page 154, my opinion is that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all and is seen only with an effort, and when seen is also inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light and of the Lord of light in this visible world, the Lord of light is the sun, and the immediate source of reason and truth in the intellectual, and that this is the power upon which he who would act rationally either in public or private life must have his eyes fixed. So then he talks about this beatific vision. So they both say the goal of the philosopher is to help people make this effort to have this intuition. Okay, that will wrap it up for Bergson. The next reading will be Nick Bostrom, and the title of that reading is The Simulation Argument, Why the Probability That You Are Living in a Matrix is Quite High. So we'll come back to that.